Okay, we have a few minutes to change over to move to the first panel. We'll start at 2 o'clock. If the panelists could come up.
Okay, great. And I'll tell you what, I'll just put you back up there.
Okay, wow. There is somebody on the boards. So, in fact, I have a message for everybody from our legal overlords.
Is this from the NSA Intercept?
No. They just listen. They don't talk.
Oh, okay.
So many of you will have heard this language before. And I'm afraid I won't be able to keep a straight face, but I will read this for the benefit of those who actually need this read, which is, all participants in the conference are reminded that the FCC's anti-collusion rules are in effect for companies that have submitted short-form applications for the AWS-3 auction. I'm not going to read the rest of the boilerplate because those who have submitted applications know what obligations rest on them. Good luck, folks, with that.
Yeah, right. Bye and bye.
All right, good. So, so that's out of the way. The other thing I had to get out of the way is I just want to apologize to all the lawyers in the room for the fact that I'm wearing a tie. I know I'm setting a really bad example. I apologize. But my insecurity got the better of me. So this is the first panel. We're talking about bottoms-up coordination here. And what I want to hear from all the panelists and then move to a conversation with you as well is how do we do bottoms-up coordination? I proposed in my intro, we talked about band agents. Another topic which is very much in the air at the moment is spectrum access systems, which is a decentralized way of managing access to spectrum on a dynamic basis. So which of these things work, how do they work, and how do we push this forward? So let me just start by going down and asking each panelist a question, and then we'll just get into the conversation. So before I do that, what I should do is to just introduce the folks who are here. You can read about them in your notes. So we have Milo Medin, who's the head of Google Fiber at the company who I need not name.
Actually, it's Vice President of Access Services.
Oh, even better, Vice President.
Well, the Access Services, we do wireless as well.
Access Services, so that's like the access of, the access of do no evil.
Oh, that's a different kind of access.
Yes.
You're supposed to moderate.
Wow.
Yeah.
You need to moderate Pierre.
Yeah, I know. Then we have Paul Margie, who's a partner at Harris Wiltshire and Grannis. We have Nancy Victory, who's a partner at Wiley, Rein, and former assistant secretary at the Department of Commerce. We actually do not have Steve Sharkey, who mailed us last night. He had a crisis that he had to attend to. And in his place, I'm delighted to announce we have Tom Dombrowsky. Tom is an engineer's engineer. He's at Wiley Ryan, engineering advisor. And he actually got an email from me when his plane landed in Denver this morning asking him if he would join us.
I said no, and you
I know.
That definitely sounds like command and control.
Well, I threatened him with an epithet, and, and he decided to come. So let's just start this conversation, Milo.
Forgot Mark.
Oh, Mark! Oh, my God.
This is going to be a fun panel.
This is going to be a fun panel, yeah. So, like, this is how to get all the panelists against you, right? So, Mark is a senior director of business development at Comsearch. So, Milo, why decentralize? What are we trying to do?
It's a good question. Engineers like to figure out what the target is before you figure out what ordinance to put against it. And so I think there's a few things from my perspective that I think decentralized management can empower. First off, getting spectrum into service in the U.S. For wireless broadband takes a long time. By our back of the envelope calculations, about 8.4 years. By the way, we don't count AWS 3 in that because it's not actually in service. In Silicon Valley, we actually talk about turning things on and users using things as opposed to passing laws or doing auctions. So speeding up the ability for spectrum to move from one kind of use to another or shared use from the current state of affairs is probably the single biggest benefit of moving away from command and control. I think also making it easier to use spectrum that's idle. In 2006, Comcast won a bunch of spectrum in the AWS-1 auction, and the next day said, "Don't worry, investors, we have no intention on building on it." Well, that spectrum sat idle for a long time, generating no public interest value. And by the way, idle commercial spectrum, the feds look at that and go, well, why should I go relocate when you guys are sitting around and spectrum's assigned but not being actually used? So, I think empowering more secondary use, more opportunistic use of idle spectrum can help avoid failures like this. And, lastly, radios have become much more flexible, and access to the technology has become much more democratized. So there are more players now that can use spectrum in lots of innovative ways. These sort of innovators don't do well in a command and control ecosystem of, filing ex partes and spending time in DC. Unlicensed spectrum created a huge outpouring of innovation and investment. But we should recognize that the pure unlicensed model also imposes limitations on innovation. And so making spectrum more available to more kinds of players, I think, is going to unlock another set of innovation, like what we had in the pure unlicensed world. And so that kind of move to more bottoms-up, more opportunistic use, less command and control, I think all those things are potentially big wins.
So let me just pick up on that. It sounds to me as if when you hear the word decentralization, you think unlicensed.
No. I think, certainly with regards to, we don't have to operate in 50 style allocation anymore, where it's, this is the use for this band, or it's a free-for-all. We think that software can make things better. So, for example, in the spectrum access system, one of the things we did on the PCAST, if you remember, we talked about replacing poobahs with code. And so I think, we at Google are not scared of software. And so we think we can do a lot to more automate and arbitrate access to spectral resources and do things a little bit better than the way they have been done today.
So, thinking about decentralization, when I hear you say replace poobahs with code, I can gloss that in another way. And so I'm looking for, so what's the downsides of decentralization? So let's say you could read that as saying replace our political representatives with software developers.
I think
is that actually a good thing?
I think a lot of carriers after this week would agree with that. But nonetheless, I think the issue is really, policymakers should provide policy input. And the dynamic range of policies, when you have more automation, is larger, as opposed to simply, this is the way this spectrum is going to be used for the next 20 years, for this use.
Great. So Milo's really teed up a bunch of ideas for us in terms of how one might get benefit from decentralization. Paul, you sit in DC and you do this every day. You know all the levers. So what are the levers for making this kind of stuff happen? Which ones are easy to pull? Which ones are hard?
Sure, and I think understanding those levers, and maybe, for me, maybe they're more like dials than levers, because, the lever implies that we've got, as Milo was saying, either the all on or all off, right? And so I think a lot of these are dials. So to get where you and Milo are looking at, I think it is important to look at what the specific dials are that the FCC or the other agencies or in other countries' agencies might have at their disposal to move from command and control to less command and control. And I think, and it is important to look at them very specifically, because you'll see that the FCC and other countries have done it more in some areas and more in others. And so you've got the extreme version, which is you set the dial to 11, right? And you say, okay, we're gonna do complete command and control. We're the government. We're here to help you. We're going to tell you what to do, when to do it, and how to do it. And then you've got the other one where you turn it all the way down, and you'll pry my radio out of my cold dead hand. The government don't touch my business, and you have no rules whatsoever. But most of it is really in the middle, and I think a lot of the interesting parts of devolving this to a SaaS or a database or a band, I'm not supposed to call it band agent, not band manager, is in that middle side. And understanding how each of those dial positions relate to the big goal of maximizing utility, right? So we all want to maximize the utility of each of these services. And if you are saying, okay, command and control or no command and control is always the way to maximize utility, you're probably going to make a mistake. And so, there are big benefits to command and control bright line rules. And the biggest one is predictability. And so you can say, if you've got really excellent predictability, you might be able to design your business better. You might be able to understand your costs and therefore set your prices better. You might be able to engage in more efficient transactions. So there are benefits to bright line rules. On the other hand, bright line rules set by governments that are inflexible also limit the amount of flexibility that businesses can engage in, either now or as technology changes in the future. They also require governments to make guesses about technology or about business plans, both of which, people like me, we're great at that, right? And so if you have these bright line rules, you have to make guesses, and you make mistakes when you do that. And so, so then what are the dials? So here are just 3 of them that we seem to be playing with a lot lately. One is power. So you can have the all-the-way command and control version of power, which is we're going to have a maximum power level. We're going to define that for all devices in all places at all times, no matter what. Here's your number. And then everybody knows it's good in some ways because it's predictable. You know what your co-channel neighbor is going to do. You know what your adjacent channel neighbor is going to do. And there's just a number. On the other side, you could imagine the anti-command and control side of this of saying there are going to be no power levels whatsoever. We're just going to deal with this on a case-by-case prospective basis through tort or through efficient transactions. Ray Gifford will tell you about efficient transactions, right? Can deal with this. We can sue each other before the Pierre's court in these. But then in the middle, you've got some really interesting positions on the dial where you can say, okay, we're going to allow you to use different power based on what you do, different power based on where you are. So if you've got a personal portable device, maybe your power is less than if you've got a fixed device. If you are in a geography that allows you to have higher power, we're going to allow you to have higher power. And once we design tools that allow the decision maker, whether that's a devolved or centralized decision maker, to do that, it gives us more flexibility. So the next big dial is geography and frequency, right? So this is the other thing that we often define. So you have the command and control version of geography and frequency that says the government's going to say, here's a map, here's, no matter what you are or who you are or what your power is, here's where you can be and here's where you can't be. And then the other side would be there is no map. You can go wherever you want, and we'll sue each other or we'll contract around inefficiencies when we see them. And then in the middle, you've got these other flexible kind of ideas if you had a tool to do it, where you could say, all right, we're going to let you into this area if your power is lower. Or we're going to let you into this area if the guy who we're worried about isn't there today or isn't there at night. Or if you directionalize your antenna or do something that we haven't thought of yet. Or we might do something that says, okay, we're going to really measure what happens to them in a dynamic way to be able to do that. And then the last big one, and Meredith talked about this, is service restrictions or what you do type restrictions. And so the command and control old version would be, we're the government, we're going to tell you what you do with that particular frequency. And so you have to do maritime, but God forbid you do aviation in that same band. Or, you've got to have a radio in a car in this band, but you better not have one in an office building in this band. Or you have to do GSM, but you can't do CDMA. And the one that we've heard about that we've moved towards is these flexible use licenses where we tell people, okay, you can grow as technology grows. You can change your approach as the business plan or technologies change. And then the reality is we're most of the time not all the way there. We're in the middle where we say, okay, you can do almost everything, but maybe you can't have an airborne radio. We'll give you flexibility, but not airborne. Or we'll give you flexibility, but you can't do a jammer in that band. Or maybe when you're in a shared band, you can do it, but you can't intentionally interfere with somebody, or you can't really hog up all the spectrum, something like that. So, but no matter what these levers are, I think it's important to look at them hard because there's a tendency to get trapped into saying, okay, I really like command and control in some situations, but I don't in others. And I'm going to say, as a principle, command and control is, means I'm not going to invest because if there's too much command and control, it's not good for investment. And then the next day you come back in another situation, you say, you know what? If we don't have some predictability here through command and control, there's no way I'm going to invest. And so I think we need to get beyond there and start thinking about the specifics.
So you tee up what I have learned hanging out with lawyers like Pierre Schlag here is that the classic lawyer's dichotomy between rules and standards. You're saying the one gives you flexibility, the other one gives you certainty. It doesn't sound as if you... Let me put this as a question. Where are we right now vis-a-vis the sweet spot in those settings? Or does it depend on which client is involved?
Wow, he really is going after all of us.
So cynical.
I thought I was just going to get the tie gag. After my clients, too.
I'm wearing the tie.
Wow. It certainly doesn't depend on who the client is. No, I think it depends on where the band is and when the rules were written in a lot of ways,
Right.
So I think
Right.
we're getting better, but we're still living with rules that were written a long time ago, assuming a different set of transactions, and you can look and see who's the incumbent. How long has that technology been around? And you can probably guess that the rules related to it are worse the older it is. Okay, that's unless it's a government ban and those are more complicated. But that's one thing. We have seen great progress in things like service, right? So we've moved away from places where we've got very strict command and control rules on that. We have seen on this is a little different than one of the dials that I talked about, ownership. Right? So ownership has become much more flexible in the way that we do that.
Right.
In power, we don't always just have strict maximum power levels. I mean, look what they did in the white spaces area, right? There's some interesting things. Look what they're proposing in 600.
But you say, give an example for the white space?
So in white space, there's a different power level for portable devices than there is for fixed devices. That's kind of smart, right? And so in the 3.5 band, they're thinking about maybe having different opportunities based on where you are or what your radio actually does, even how efficient your radio is. So those are pretty good. In the 5 gigahertz band, we just had in Uni 1 a situation where we said, okay, we're not just going to look at power as power. We're going to say, okay, you can get up to 1 watt if you have an antenna restriction, so it's not pointing straight up at the antenna. Those are all things that wouldn't have happened in the last generation of policy making. So I think we have moved forward in all of those, but there are other places where we just haven't.
So so what I think I'm hearing you say is, and this is a very nice model, one has to be nuanced in defining command and control. It's a range, it's not a fixed point. We have made progress, but we haven't made sufficient progress. There's still work to be done.
It's certainly right, but I also think the other part of that is that all command and control is not bad, right? It's not that command and control is bad and no command and control is good. It's that you've got all these tools, and we should look at all the tools in our toolbox, and we should look at the job that we're trying to make them do.
Right.
And we should be sophisticated about applying the right tool to the right job.
Very good. We should come back to that because I think that's a really important point. But I want to move on and ask Nancy to sort of reflect on what you've heard so far. And I think that one of the things that comes to mind for me is what Paul has teed up is how far do you take command and control? When do you apply it?
Well, I know Pierre asked as the former regulator on the panel to make sure that I use the regulator part of my brain in answering some of these questions. But I also have a lot of private sector clients, so I'm also very familiar with the business issues. So the struggle over spectrum management that we have is going on inside my brain right now, actually. But your question about how far do we take command and control, I think in talking about spectrum management, it's very important to think about it in layers or in dimension, because all command and control is not bad, as Paul was saying. It's necessary. But I want to even look at it a slightly different way, because I think where we've made a lot of progress over the last couple of years, especially where the FCC has made a lot of progress, is within various bands, particularly if they are exclusive licensed or if there is a sort of a single primary use. The FCC has made great strides in providing flexibility of that use, not defining the radio standards that need to be used, but rather allowing flexibility, defining a fixed service, a mobile service, and allowing flexibility going forward as to actually how the technology develops in the band. And I think we see with commercial wireless providers, we've seen an evolution of technology that's been able to be implemented relatively rapidly, which is wonderful. We don't have to go back to the government for a multi-year slog through the standards. Yet we do need command and control if we're talking about making sure that the uses, the very different uses that are occurring within shared spectrum, as we're trying to sandwich more uses into that spectrum, there does need to be a decision-making body, whether it's the government or whether it is an outside manager of some sort. Somebody has to be making a decision as to what are the rules to allow multiple services to coexist in a band. Some of those services are going to require more protection than others. And so there needs to be somebody exercising some command and control there. And then I'm going to take it up a level too with regard to which uses are occurring within which bands to the extent that they're next to each other, there's a problem potentially with interference, adjacent channel interference, making sure, again, that there is some exercise of a structure that is put in place. Somebody needs to be making that decision. It can't be a chaotic free-for-all. So, looking within those dimensions, there does need to be some command and control that's taking place. I would also indicate that certainly I have a lot of experience on the federal side, having been at NTIA, and particularly given the uses that you have over there, there's a lot of sharing of spectrum that occurs on the federal side between different agencies, different uses. Those uses change from time to time, and obviously many of those uses cannot be divulged to the public. For that reason, the government is always going to have to have some involvement there, and probably a pretty hands-on involvement as to how that spectrum is being used. And then I'll sort of add one more area where there probably always is going to need to be a fair amount of command and control, and that's really where there are safety issues involved, whether we're talking about public safety spectrum or where we're talking about air traffic control, and there are significant risks associated with things going wrong. The government is probably going to be very reluctant to give up a very hands-on role there, although what's interesting is I think the whole FirstNet experiment is an interesting one. It's a quasi-governmental entity that's going to be building and operating a nationwide network, but you might say, well, that's more command and control than allowing all of the state and local entities to go out and build their own networks. Well, this should be much more spectrum efficient. It should be over time a more resource efficient. I don't know whether they're going to be able to get it up and running. I think it's a big lift, but the ideas are right. And you could say it's more command and control in terms of having one network, but you've also shifted a lot of that now into one entity that is going to be providing services to a whole community.
So, we've been talking about command and control so far a lot, which is, given that the conversation is about decentralization, I suppose we end up saying, well, what do we mean by the opposite? And what you said, Nancy, raises so many interesting questions for me. One of them is, I think I heard you say there are many of these cases where you need a decision-making body. You need somebody to make a decision. When I've had this conversation, this kind of conversation sometimes with economists about, so the regulator needs a way to make this decision, the economists tend to say, and sometimes the engineers say, just let the market figure it out. Why does anybody need to make a decision, a centralized decision?
Well, I think if you're dealing with some services that are not motivated by the market or by commercial means, I think you definitely need the regulator in there. So if you're dealing with any sort of the government services, any sort of public safety services where market forces are not going to drive that, you definitely need a regulator involved. There may be other types of services where for public interest reasons there is a benefit of having those services. And those are things that a regulator could decide. But I don't disagree. I think in many cases, and I think one of the challenges for our industry is technology develops, tastes change, new devices are created, and there are platform shifts. And those platform shifts will require changes in spectrum management, will require changes in allocation, and hopefully should generate more spectrum efficiency. But I don't disagree. If you're dealing with a bunch of commercial services, that theory should work. I think it's this debate sometimes comes up with respect to some of the TV channels and the move over to commercial wireless, because a very large percentage get their broadcast signals, if you will, from cable or from satellite. But there are a number of people within the country, a significant number still, who rely on over-the-air broadcast. If you can auction this spectrum and make a lot of money by providing it for wireless services that are clearly growing, I think the economists would say it's time to make people sign up for cable and let's get rid of the over-the-air broadcasting. But obviously there are public interest reasons for not disenfranchising those users, disenfranchising those licensees that have made investments, and that's why we've had this big struggle. I think the whole idea of an incentive auction is a great way of dealing with a stalemate that we've had for quite some time.
But I want to push this a little bit, perhaps into the realm of implausibility, but let's think about the case where it's not a negotiation between, let's say, a commercial user and a federal user. So the federal users are experiencing the same pressures and demands as the commercial users. And, this is where your experience running NTIA is relevant. So I can imagine already and more in the future, we will have agencies who are competing with each other and saying, I need this, and somebody else says, no, I need this more than you. No, I need this more than you. So is it always going to be the head of the NTIA that has to make that decision? Is there a way to decentralize that conflict?
It was interesting. I was moderating a panel yesterday where I had both the general from the Department of Defense and the head of the Office of Spectrum Management from NTIA, and we were talking about some of these issues, particularly what could be incentives for the federal government to give up spectrum? What are the incentives that exist today or could exist with respect to federal government reducing their amount of spectrum? It was very interesting to hear the Department of Defense say that they are trying to reduce their spectrum footprint, largely because they have other uses they want to sandwich into the spectrum that they're using now. But he was walking us through the process that occurs when they have a new use for spectrum. Let's put aside the existing use becoming more efficient, but where they have a new use for spectrum, the way they have to justify it internally in terms of dollars spent, the way they have to justify it to NTIA before the spectrum can be allocated to them. It's very much of a command and control. It's almost like back to the comparative hearings that the FCC used to undertake. It's not based on commercial forces as much as it should. And so one of the things we were discussing as part of the panel was a spectrum fee, or bringing other commercial forces down, particularly for giving up spectrum or for making the government pay commercial rates for spectrum. And I think many of them have great appeal, not necessarily to the government, but as a management tool for making sure that the same or similar competitive pressures that the private sector faces are brought to bear on the management of government resources. But you're right. Right now, it's really the NTIA that makes this decision with respect to proposals that are able to clear the internal agency review of additional expenditures.
Okay, thank you.
Hey, Pierre, can I push back on something you said just for 1 second?
Yeah.
Which is, I thought you said that we have a choice between command and control and decentralization. And I'm not sure that's true, right? I think that you can have decentralization where one of the new categories of agents that you're talking about is the one that's imposing the rules, right? There's still some command and control going on there. It's just not maybe the government that's doing it, or the government initiates the general rules, and then you have somebody else enforcing those rules. And so I think we can still get a lot of the predictability benefits of command and control without some of the time constraints and politics and
viscosity.
But then define for me what you have in mind by command and control in that sense. Because what I'm hearing you say is Verizon and AT&T, they do command and control in their licensed spectrum. The SAS in 3.5 will be doing command and control. Is that what you mean?
Yes.
Absolutely.
Right. Okay.
I mean, especially since commercial operators can and do lease their spectrum.
Right.
Yeah. And that's part of what I meant by it's not about unlicensed per se, right? You could use unlicensed technology in a piece of spectrum where you enjoy protection, right? And so this business of having protection and exclusivity tied together, that doesn't have to be the case, right?
Okay.
There are ways of teasing those apart, and I think there's new kinds of innovation that can happen in this intermediate space between pure unlicensed and purely exclusive, right? Particularly if the license blocks are small and enterprises and medical device and companies and all these other folks can get at spectrum and be assured of protection as well.
Okay, so I want to get to Mark, but let me just make sure I'm following here. What I'm hearing is that perhaps we should define command and control as the definition of the values of operating parameters, transmit power, frequency, space, and the uses that you may put that permission to. And you're saying, yes, that could be something that the government does, but it could also be something decentralized or delegated.
The range from pure command and control, maybe no matter who, whether it's government control or something else control, is are you going to have just plain, bright line, inflexible command and control rules where it always happens all the time in the same way?
Right.
Or are you going to go more and more towards flexibility? And I think what Milo was saying is when you get away from the government as the commander and controller, then you get lots more tools to be able to do things less than pure bright line and flexible rules because you have a lot more power in these other commanders and controllers.
Right. And so I think for me, when I say command and control, I mean government command and control in this definition. So let me.
Can I just add one?
Yes.
I want to muddy that up a bit because I think even if you have a band manager or if you have a private entity that's making evolving decisions about the technology and the services to be deployed, there probably still is some overarching general command and control parameter that the government has already put on the spectrum to make sure that it doesn't bleed over into the neighboring uses. So you're going to probably have some aspect of government command and control almost on any spectrum band.
Okay. So, Mark, unfortunately, what these guys have succeeded in doing is really confuse me about how I should frame the question that I wanted to ask you. Because, you know, as you all know,
even, Pierre.
Yeah, I know. Well, that's why I do this, to get you guys riled up, right? It's not quite WWF, but you know, we'll get there. So, Mark really understands this very well because you've done, you know, your company's done, you have done, command and control in this delegated way. So, from your perspective, with command and control little c or big C, where does it work?
Well, you know, it's interesting. We're getting into an existential discussion of what is command and control, and I think that's cool. I'm going to go back to what Milo said at the beginning, replacing poobahs with code. Because I think we can all agree on that because, you know, a database-enabled system is autonomous, it's flexible, it has a set of guidelines and principles, and it's not immutable. We can all agree on that. White space is working. 3.5 gig surely will work. So that's one side of the dial that Paul's talking about. The other side of the dial, I think I've changed your dials a little bit, but the other side of the dial is some bands that probably don't lend themselves right now to that type of an operation. Take, for example, the land mobile bands. You know, there's this melange of just total different types of operation. I think the last time I looked in the ULS, there were over 200,000 licenses. And with varying bandwidths going all the way up to 25 kilohertz and 50 kilohertz, which is pretty wide band for land mobile. You know, they're just, you know, phones. You talk FirstNet, which is going to be LTE kind of, but so you know, there's.
Sorry, could you just explain for folks like me who don't really grasp that? When I'm out in the world, when do I see land mobile?
Well, you see land mobile when you you get pulled over by the police and they call back and say, here's so-and-so's driver's license, and are there any wants and warrants on them? They're on the radio, or they're probably on some sort of a land mobile system. You can buy a family radio that's land mobile. The police and safety use them a lot, but they're used to dispatch factories. They're used to dispatch cabs. When you go to make when you go to McDonald's, they're using a land mobile system to communicate with you to that box that you can't understand there by the mouth.
And just recall, a lot of these are developed pre-cellular. So
Pre-cellular.
Pre-cellular.
I thought you said pre-Stone Age, and that couldn't be right.
Pre-80s.
So there's certain areas that would lend themselves to command and control, and there are areas where, or not command, non-commanded or autonomous, and those are areas where you have not a lot of dissimilar use or not a lot of the same use, and that would be like the land mobile. So take, for example, white space. That's an excellent example that lends itself to sort of a database-enabled system. There's some bugs being worked out. Some of the sharing issues with CMRS and with WMTS, they'll get worked out. We have databases that are stood up now. That'll work. That'll be fine. But there's an analogy that I kind of think of when I was sitting here listening to this, and there's two analogies actually. One is the autonomous car, the driverless car. When you think about, you can operate a driverless car pretty easily in the middle of the desert when there's nobody around. You try to take that same concept and put it in downtown LA or downtown Washington or even Boulder perhaps. It isn't going to work so good. And why is that? Well, you've got nothing else going on around you, and it's easy to mitigate along there. And Google's doing some great work in that area, no surprise. But when you get down into a downtown area, you're trying to have a computer do the types of things that people can do 1,300 times a second, give or take. And so if we're going to try to develop database-enabled systems to enable the type of operation where that's going to have that type of demand on it, we're going to have to do what Meredith said earlier. We're going to have to crawl, walk, run.
Yeah.
And so I think what we're doing now is we're in the crawl stage. And another example is the National Airspace System with the Next-Gen Air Traffic Management, which if anybody's looked at that, that is immensely complicated. However, the FAA's came up with this, and it's similar to this with what we're doing with spectrum management. You have air traffic control that controls just about everything in controlled airspace. And what they're trying to do now is not only allow for general aviation to work in there, but now drones. And in a situation where above 18,000 feet, the air traffic controller controls everything. So trying to get from that, which is kind of like what we have with the PUBAs controlling spectrum, to where aircraft are flying by themselves is a similar analogy. And what's the complication? What's all this other stuff that's happening in the middle? And so, what we see a lot of the time is, for example, in the bands that we work in is the microwave bands. There are about 50,000 to 75,000 microwave links, depending upon how many bands you look at out there. And if you look at all the microwave links plotted on a map, there is white space. And so there would be a way to work that in there. But the problem you've got is, how do you allow the legacy systems to operate in there, much like we're doing with TV stations? And so you end up having to possibly do some sort of a contour or whatever. Not even sure how that would work. So we've heard as we've walked down the panel lots of interesting ideas, and I'm sure Tom will have his own, about how some of the issues related with command and control versus database enabled. But I think from an existential standpoint, it really gets to Milo's point, the PUBAs and the code.
So, it's interesting. On the how do you draw the white space, I think Bob Matheson's electrospace might help with the directional part of that space.
We've talked.
I'm sure you have. But, what intrigues me is, and this begins to get us to well, so what do we do about this? Mm-hmm. As we, for example, try and do less PUBA and more code, as you try and, decentralize this more, are there things that the government, the policymakers, regulators should be doing to enable these systems, right? To go from crawl to walk, or to go from lying on your back squealing to crawling?
Yes. And this may sound somewhat heretical, but I think it would be helpful for them to stand up a set of rules that we've all agreed to through the regulatory process and then get out of the way. Even so far as allowing other entities to do certification of systems. And this is maybe Mark speaking now, not even Comsearch, and so if I go back and don't have a job. But it's, Whitespace is a good example where they had a real heavy hand on that. Yeah. They had to, because they had really competing interests. And if you did an after-action study on it, you probably would have done it the same way. But if we're looking at 3.5 and other bands, where there need to be some guidelines of how to share, but it's just like setting the top in motion and letting it spin. Right. We should be allowed, we being industry, to use the engineering, brilliance of companies like Google and Microsoft and others within the framework that they set up in terms of just guideline rules, and then back away.
Well, it's interesting because one of the things that Phil and I speculated about with band agents that would be useful and important is that a band agent would have the power to negotiate changes in the existing rules with band neighbors. Yeah. So for example, you say, one of the things we should do is stand up rules and walk away. Now, what kind of rules? One of the rules might be any of these rules can be changed. Mm-hmm. Would you support a meta rule that said you can obsolete any of the rules?
You still need to, there's one thing that you need to have, and that's assurance that everybody's playing by the rules.
Right. Okay.
And so you need to have the regulatory entity there acting in their enforcement, so that there's some recourse, for a harm. And as long as you've got that, and there's some facility for grievance and whatnot, And that could even be automated to some extent. We've been talking about that. We talked about that at the Wizard Workshop a few weeks ago, automating enforcement. If you've got a band manager, and actually the commission did this with band managers, they call them band managers a few years ago. Now, it was a little bit more that. They actually bought the spectrum at auction, and they were the ones that could do it within certain guidelines. And that's a similar example. They had some basic framework to operate in, and the commission kind of backed away. So, again, I think that if you have some basic rules, which are that all rules can change, but we all play in the sandbox together, and we understand that there is some recourse for enforcement and some recourse for grievance. I'm not saying it's going to be utopia, but it should enable a little bit more of the code and less of the poobah.
Great.
I love that.
So let's turn to Tom, and Tom is going to start the next phase of this conversation, which is sort of folks reacting to what they've heard, and I'm sure Tom has some of his own ideas too, but feel free, Tom, to join the general beating up that I sort of started. And very shortly, I'll take it to the audience and ask you to contribute as well. And of course, I will be starting with students. So, Tom.
So I'll start with my point of view is I think we are pretty far along here. I don't think command and control is really what we've been dealing with for the last 20 years. And if you go to any other country in the world and they look at the U.S. market and how we regulate and deal with things, they like the U.S. market a heck of a lot better than they like theirs. I go to the Mobile World Congress every year, and every keynote panelist that stands up there says, how do we become more like the U.S.? How do we get less command and control in our spectrum policies? So that's number one. So number one is it's not as bad as everybody thinks it is. It could be worse.
Have we gone too far?
No, I don't think we've gone too far. And I think what we've done is, and there's two things I always come back to with this, inertia and trust. So the inertia part, believe it or not, if you give people more freedom, they sometimes don't want it. I was at the FCC for a long time. I had people where I said, look, I'm going to de-license you. You don't have to come to me and ask for me for anything else. And they said, oh, no. You can't do that. And I'm going to Congress. I'm going to stop you from doing that because I want that license from you. So we have to overcome that inertia. And in addition, we have a thing right now where the FCC is saying they're no longer going to give paper licenses out. It's going to have to be electronic. There's people pitching a fit over that. So inertia is number one. We have to get over inertia. Okay? So number two is trust. And the big trust problem we have is if you go too fast with this stuff, you're going to hear about it for the rest of your life, and it's going to stop any progress forward after that. And I'll give you a great example. And Pierre knows this one really well. Garage door openers. How many times do we hear about garage door openers from the federal government?
You didn't hear it now until you said it. But.
Right.
You let these unlicensed guys in there. They're out there willy-nilly. There's no enforcement. And we get all these complaints about people's garage door openers not working near the military base because we're using our licensed spectrum that we're the primary user for, that you guys let have some other rights beneath us, and now we're the bad guys. So you got to have inertia and you got to have trust sort of resolved and figured out right from the start, from my perspective. And I think, again, from my perspective, because I've been doing this for a long time, where we are now versus when I started in the FCC in the 80s, where I had to have people come to me one by one, getting a particular site, particular frequency, a particular power, particular bandwidth, and I had to have a person look at that and say yes, no, or I had to have Mark's group actually bless it, and we'd look at what Mark did and tell him he did it wrong. I mean, so we've come a long, long way. I mean, I just don't want to underestimate that compared to where we were just a few decades ago.
You know, when you say inertia and distrust, you know what?
Just trust, not distrust.
No. But presumably, trust is the good thing. The problem is distrust, in the same way that the problem is inertia. And so, it raises, and in fact, both of them remind me, one can't spend too much time with Dale, and you learn to think about incentives. So the question for you is, having seen this happen, what are the incentives for somebody to overcome the inertia? When they came to you and said, no, don't take those constraints on me away, I like those constraints, what do you offer them?
You have to make it a win-win. You have to have some skin in the game with any negotiation, right? If you come to me and say, hey, I've got to move you to a new house, it's going to be less house, and it's less square feet, and it's going to cost you more, would you like to move? I'm going to say no. Right. But if you say, you're in a small 1,000-square-foot house, I'm going to move you to a 2,500 square foot house in a better school system, and it's going to cost you $1,000 less a month to have it, would you like to do that? Yeah, I'm going to take that deal. So I think you have to treat people with respect, and you have to treat their concerns with respect, and you have to make it so that it's interesting to them and there's an advantage to them. Now, the intractable problem we've been dealing with is the federal government. So the problem with the federal government and their spectrum use is spectrum use for the federal government is a means to an end. They have a mission. The mission is not using spectrum. The mission is protecting the country and protecting the warfighter, if you will. That's what they'll say every time you get them in front of these people.
That's the DOD, but the DOD isn't the only part of the federal government,
Yeah,
right?
well,
or is it the only part of the federal government?
The FAA says planes will crash and people will die. And
That's
we'll
right.
go down through each of these groups, and
Okay.
they'll all have their party lines that are very similar to that. So when you have those guys that spectrum is not a key part of their mission, you have to find a way to say, look, we want to reuse your spectrum, but on the upside, we're going to help you with your mission. And how are we going to help you with your mission to do your mission better, cheaper, faster, stronger, and I still get the spectrum from you? Go ahead.
Yeah, and if I could just pile on
Please.
on that a little bit, we've worked quite a bit with the Department of Defense in the 3.5 effort, and I sense a lot of openness and to new ideas and to collaboration, but you have to start from the perspective of they have a job to do, and again, it's what can you do to help them get their job done efficiently. One of the bigger problems that the government has is, I used to work for NASA. 25 years ago, all of the advanced communications research was being done in the federal side. Now, all of that, almost all of it is being done on the commercial side. And device volumes are critical to taking advantage of the kind of technologies that go into these modern devices. So I was talking to some folks from the DOD the other day, and I said, the rapture has happened and you've all been left behind, right? And it's permanently behind, right? Because they don't have enough volume to justify the investment in these kind of devices.
Right.
What's worse, our enemies don't have the option of using these systems. They all use the commercial systems, right? So part of what you get by putting commercial users in federal bands is the ability to get ecosystems of commercial parts that while they may be used in shared bands here in the United States, those same components can be used in devices that are tactical systems or more enterprise use overseas. And I think there's a win-win here. And I think increasingly, I at least see that the federal users and the DoD are willing to actually partner and work together on things. I don't think it has to be as adversarial as oftentimes it is painted.
What's interesting is, a number of you have talked about what you've just said, Milo, which is people need to talk to each other. And I'm reminded of Eleanor Ostrom's model for managing common pool resources. And she has these 8 principles. And one of them is when you have a complex system, you have to have nested governance. So, you have governance at multiple layers, and I think that's the conversation we were having earlier about command and control. You need different flavors of command and control at different layers. So one question for any of you who want to respond to it is, let's take this federal use of DoD. How decentralized can we make this conversation? So these incentives, the win-wins. Can you have a conversation with the base? Does it have to be a service? Could it be an agency? Can it be all at the same time?
It really depends. The systems are very heterogeneous, right? I mean, you really have to look at the engineering does matter.
But do you? I had Paul. Go ahead.
Yeah, you can talk to an individual base. That happens.
Right.
And so, it's not on the big policy things. You can't say, we're gonna convince this one base in Utah that they should put their thumb on the Pentagon. But on individual places where you actually are in the same band, this happens a lot, where you work and you try to solve a problem, just like two CMRS carriers that are neighbors with each other, or two broadcasters, two cell phone companies that are next to each other as co-channel neighbors, or two broadcasters might work together. I think you do see where unlicensed and, for example, and DoD are in the same band. They do resolve small issues.
Are there any examples, concrete examples you can give us?
There are. A lot of them aren't publicly available, if you will. But
well, that's right. To the extent that you can give us a concrete example.
Carriers with bases to say, for example, the base had a real problem. They're not getting good cell coverage on that base.
Right.
And there's a big reason for that because they won't let any cell sites on the base. So the discussion was, okay, can we get access to your base to actually build out cell coverage, and we'll give you either discounted rates for your members, or we'll create a special service, a more ruggedized service for the base, for the MPs versus the regular GI that's on the base, et cetera. And they carved out, because believe it or not, a lot of military bases are not where there are a lot of people. They tend to put them in the very obscure places so they can do training. So because of that, the cell provider is not building out to those areas in a lot of cases. But if they have a confined several thousand person base of subscribers that they can work with and actually get the access to, there have been cases where that has actually happened, to the point of saying it's just for the base and it's not even part of the cellular network in some of the cases.
Right,
But
but
there's
those are all solving local, you know, I'm not going to say they're unique issues. They may be common to a number of bases, but they're solving it for a particular incident or for a particular problem. They're not clearing a band nationwide, which has to be done in a more centralized.
Is there any way in which
But that's
these?
the question, right? This nested governance.
That's
meaning
right. Does it help?
There
Would
are
it help
times
to
where
do
we
that?
need to do this, but there are other times where we do it smaller. And even the garage door case, remember, that was an individual set of locations that was solved,
Right.
And the solution was people are going to have to change their garage doors, right? And so I think that is an example of where you had something.
But I think there's a problem with, I mean, what you all are talking about is sort of down in the dirty, specific issues. One example is the Joint Spectrum Center does a lot of that, now the DSO on behalf of commercial carriers. In fact, that's a whole line of business. But when you step it up a level, when you talk about policy, you know, we ran into this in CSMAC when we were doing the 5 working groups. And, you know, the DOD was there, and so were all the other agencies. And they were committing their time and their effort and their money for no reason other than they saw the value. And so, you know, in order for this really to work properly on both sides, there need to be equal incentives on the government side, and they're not the same type of incentives that we have on the commercial side. So on the government side, what are the incentives to, I won't say using spectrum more efficiently, because I think they'd argue that they're using spectrum as efficiently as they can for their mission. But what are their incentives to participate in the sharing discussion? Because they have an entirely different mission profile. Tom said it. You know, their mission, for better or worse, is either keeping the planes in the air, keeping the warfighter from getting whatever. Our mission on the commercial side is mostly shareholders, and then customers, or customers and then shareholders. But
Well, I will actually tell you what one of the things the general mentioned yesterday is incenting them, and that is that this is supposed to be a two-way street.
Yes.
They are looking at sharing their spectrum, giving up their spectrum, but they're also looking at sharing bands that are predominantly commercial, and they view that as a tremendous opportunity.
And we're doing that in CSMAC too. There's a whole subcommittee working on bidirectional sharing. So, and it's, you know, we're moving it along.
Yeah,
but
but that seems to be very much exciting them and incenting them to participate in these
I
discussions.
just
as
want to
well.
build on what Mark said there, and then I want to really pull it out because it's important. What we did find through the CSMAC working group process that was good, a good thing that came out of it, is that dialogue and collaboration between the parties was very helpful. And that's building that trust piece that I talked about. We now know who that guy is across the other side of the table, and we found, hey, that faceless bureaucrat is actually not such a bad guy, and oh, by the way, he has a mission, and he actually has looked at this, and he is bending over backwards to actually use the spectrum appropriately.
Right.
And he's interested in what we're doing, and frankly, they had no idea what we were doing or how we were doing it and how it worked, because they were looking at, you know, 5, 6, 7-year-old technology, and we said, we're not doing that. We haven't done that in years.
Right.
So by starting that discussion,
It's myth-busting.
you built that trust, and frankly, we now have another subcommittee that we've stood up and through the CSMAC process to sort of build on that, to sort of regularize that and make that normal instead of unusual, and so that we can actually have that, all the stakeholders having discussions and working that layers that way on a regularized basis.
So one last comment from Milo, and if anybody else has a comment, and then we'll move to the question.
And I just want to, you know, we've talked a lot about the feds, but, you know, commercial sharing should not be, you know, command and control separates civil users from each other as well. And I think if you just look at the narrowband stuff that was discussed before, or other allocations, there's a lot of room for more collaboration, tearing some of these walls down and allowing spectrum to become much more flexibly used amongst the civil users.
You know, okay, chairman's prerogative. This is too interesting. Sorry, guys, but remember your questions. So, your comment, Milo, which is having these conversations among different kinds of civil users, and Tom's point about building trust on the CSMAC reminded me of the kinds of things that Charlotte Ruth has often mentioned, is that when one looks at the cellular business, folks are having these negotiations, presumably engineer to engineer, business manager to business manager, and they know each other. And I hadn't realized that, and may well be why Charlotte can correct me if I'm wrong. But it's not clear to me that these kinds of conversations, lower level conversations, are happening between different services. Are they happening between broadcasters and cellular players, for example, between FM broadcasters and LTE? Are they happening between other services? You're nodding, Tom. They are?
They are.
Because
Yes.
we keep crowding in on each other.
Yeah, right.
Didn't used to, but now everybody's using almost everything.
Right.
And so there's a lot more, now that we're in the lower bands for mobile, I mean, we're having a lot more FM and TV problems with each other.
And is that just sweetness and light, or is there anything that the FCC should do to make that better?
I think at some level, you don't want to get to the FCC.
Yeah.
That's always
Right.
the last
Yeah.
resort.
Right.
Because, as Milo can attest, you bring a problem to the FCC, get ready to wait.
Yeah.
And frankly, having been on that side of the table, the first thing I usually told a person that came to meet with me is, you don't want me
Yeah.
to decide this.
Yeah.
You guys better figure it out. If you want me to decide, both of you guys are going to be unhappy.
Yeah.
And it's going to take me a long time to get there.
Right.
Because I got to go through the bureaucrat.
But some of this stuff is even institutionalized down at a lower level. So, for example, the Society of Broadcast Engineers does a lot of interaction, and especially in the BAS bands, they're going to have to be shared with the feds.
BAS?
Broadcast Auxiliary Service. The SBE guys are getting in there. They're rolling up their sleeves, and they're an interesting bunch of guys, but they're working. And the National Spectrum Management Association is trying to broker some of these discussions to some level of success. NAB does some of this.
NAB?
So National Association of Broadcasters. So there's some grassroots associations that are trying to shepherd these discussions, but they're even happening coordinator to coordinator. When we do frequency coordination in shared bands, which we do a lot in the microwave bands, we'll call the coordinator on the other side. We do a lot of it in the federal bands.
I think I hate to do this. Transparency helps the dialogue tremendously.
Transparency in what?
In who's got allocations, where devices are. Because a lot of the coordination, right, has to do with, well, I've got something there, I've got something here. Oh, well, I didn't know that. If you actually had transparency, you knew where all the users were, you knew where all the transmitters were. Now you can do global optimization on that. ULS, I hate to bring this up, but ULS is not exactly the easiest tool for this. And I think, one of the nice things about what we've done in 3.5 is, I think when you get transparency and everybody can see who's assigned what block where, precisely what emissions they're planning to use, you now can plan around that, right? You now have other dimensions of freedom. And by the way, it empowers crowdsourced enforcement because you now have that kind of transparency of who's authorized, and you can figure out who isn't. And I think there are mechanisms there with bounties and other things that you could use to do that. But that's the next panel.
Great.
I also think there's a big difference in talking about what the FCC can do on disputes between two existing users or even easier two existing licensees and what they can do when you've got an existing set of incumbents and a newcomer coming in and asking for something. And I think the latter is much harder than the former. And there's, you're right, when you have two licensees and they've got a dispute, your advice is always, let's try to make this not go to the FCC.
Yeah.
And when it's an incumbent and a newcomer, then if the incumbent comes to you, your advice is, let's go to the FCC, right? Because
So is there anything we should do to avoid, to resolve that issue without going to the FCC?
Resolve it before going to the FCC.
Yeah.
Well, actually, there's a couple of situations where that was done. M-bands, Medical Body Area Network Service.
So explain.
Well, the Medical Body Area Network Service is a service where it's kind of a new thing. Body Area Networks actually is a new paradigm. It's actually got an AAA designation. But essentially, the idea is you wear this body sensors that communicate to some sort of a form factor on your body, and the communication takes place in the 2360 to 2400 meg band. That band is shared with the Aeronautical Mobile Telemetry. And so you had a couple of the key manufacturers that wanted to manufacture devices in that band that wanted to use it or wanted to get access to that band. And so they engaged with the AMT community at a grassroots level. It was contentious at first, but they actually over several years got to a point, and it took like 3 years, get to a point where they agreed on some coordination paradigm. And they baked that almost to the point where they did. They actually gave the commission a set of rules. And by the time it got to the commission, it was almost in the form of an NPRM. That's the way to give the commission exactly what they need. And in fact, you hear Julie and others talk about, Julie Knapp and others, they say this is an example of how to make our job easier. And there's other bands that have, I can't remember any other examples, but there are other examples of situations
Well,
where,
the DoD BAS, the
exactly.
Department of Defense
Yeah.
Broadcast Auxiliary.
And let me just challenge the transparency point a little bit, and there's two reasons.
Okay, and this will be the last one before we go to the questions.
And not in a negative way. I mean, I'm just saying a practical way. I mean, we have national security issues that they're going to throw at you with the transparency issue for the federal side. And on the commercial side, there is competitively sensitive information there. There's things that people do differentiate in the marketplace. The last thing we want is a database where their competitor goes, oh, so that's where he's focusing all his resources, and that's how I can go after him. Now, obviously, drive test, et cetera, you can figure
I mean,
that
this
out.
is, you know,
I understand.
photons are detectable.
I understand.
But
just
at a price.
At a price. There's
if
time
you
and
now
effort.
have the government providing it to you for free, as opposed to forcing you to do a drive test, that's a different.
Yeah, well, there's a lot of stuff in ULS already. The government makes it hard by making it slow, but you know, there's a lot of.
You guys could fund the database. I mean, that's the answer for the
could do that.
FCC's licensing.
that's what we do.
Good.
Do that
So,
for free. I hear you do stuff for free.
okay, so
Ad
now we
supported.
really are going to try and get some questions from the audience. But we'll come back to you guys, and you'll get multiple chances. Thank you for this wonderful conversation so far. So are there any questions from students? First, you had good warning. We have two, and we'll take both of them. Please, sir, and identify yourself.
Hi, my name's Bo Gillespie. I'm a 2L. So the most efficient use of spectrum and the most profitable use of spectrum may not always be the same thing. Are there any decentralized mechanisms by which the market could regulate the most efficient use of spectrum rather than the most profitable use of spectrum?
Can you say that second word, most efficient
Popular.
versus popular?
Profitable.
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 Yes.
So I think one of the things that you could do, if you had, for example, a tie. Let's say you had two users who want a piece of spectrum to allocate, and one of them is actually willing to coordinate timing, so now you can get much more efficient packing, and the other one isn't. You can use efficiency as a tiebreaker, right, in the allocation decision. And now those are kind of policy statements that a database could actually use to implement the access mechanisms, right? So I think those are things like that. Where there's scarcity is where that comes in. Where there's not scarcity, you know, it's less of an issue.
Actually, though, I would take a different tack. I'd say, and you heard it a little earlier, the unlicensed band maximizes both of those curves. It's pretty efficient, and it's way popular. Now, I don't know how it's popular compared to, and profitable, yeah. I don't know how it's profitable compared to other things. It's also popular. You know, but it's one of those areas where, you know, there are huge chunks of spectrum, there's a lot of stuff in them, and people are like making a lot of money on it. I don't know how it compares to some other bands, but it's popular, profitable, efficient, popular. So I think that all those curves, it's maximizing. And there's, you know, other than white space, you know, which is nascent, there's no databases controlling it at all.
Okay. The other question was over there, please.
Hi, Ethan Jeans. I'm a 3L, only because Ray's in the room. So in finding the sort of interstitial barriers between going to zero and going all the way to a easily defeated by technology, sorry. Is there, do you think, an increased role for state PUCs in whether it's a monitoring capacity, whether it's just some sort of bypass, or does the mention of increased state involvement make you all want to throw up in your mouth?
No.
I'll throw it.
The answer is no.
Okay. So we'll start at that end of the table and
I'll
work
go
this
with the
way.
latter. I mean, the idea of 50 different states with different levels of sophistication, I think we would set ourselves back tremendously. And it's one of the big benefits to the 1993 change in the law, which really took the states out of the equation very clearly, is when miraculously, obviously the auctions had something to do with it, and the policies at the FCC had something to do with it. But that also was a big reason why we suddenly had a lot more growth in the wireless realm. So, me speaking, just me personally, the last thing I would want to see is states' roles in this sort of area. grow it anyway.
And I would agree with Tom. You know, the trouble is spectrum crosses boundaries, and you can't see it. It's not like photons. And so getting the states in the middle of that, you know, I agree with Tom. And this is Mark speaking, not Comsearch. I just think that'd be setting us back.
I agree, and our firm does a tremendous amount of state preemption work on behalf of the carriers. So, yeah, no.
Yeah. Milo?
It's kryptonite.
Nice.
That implies we're supermen, right? Or women.
Right. Good. Another question.
Dale.
Let's just get the mic back there.
That's going to be a hard question. That's not fair. You can't let Dale ask.
I'm glad I'm not a panelist.
I didn't study for this. No math.
Dale Hatfield, I was interested in the medical body area network example where there was negotiation, and I think you, and I quoted Julia saying this was successful. But how do we have any real assurance that that is the welfare maximizing result? I mean, you know, people have different degrees of power, and therefore they can negotiate weakly or strongly or whatever. It's not clear to me that that's the economic efficient solution is the outcome.
You know, talking about the medical body area network, I didn't say it was right for all things. It was an example of a situation where two users of spectrum, an incumbent use and a new use, got together before there was rules to make them do it, and agreed on a sharing paradigm, took that paradigm to the commission, and then through the entire regulatory process, the commission put sunlight on it, or daylight on it, and allowed that to be transparent and people to comment. And through that regulatory process, it got tweaked heavily. In fact, it started off by having a frequency coordinator that would actually control access to the devices using an administrative key that when it got to the commission said they didn't want to use that, didn't want to try to certify that.
That's a poobah in chief.
It's a poobah in chief with code. So it's kind of, you know, not the best of all worlds. And so, so I think what we were saying that was an example of a situation where there were really only a few uses that were considered, and the users got together and worked it out. That may not work when there are myriad uses trying to get together and work things out. But you know, there's a whole spectrum of use for spectrum.
It's catchy.
Yeah,
it's catchy.
So I think, you know, one way maybe you can, you're right, so there's a power asymmetry in these negotiations, and you go to talk to an incumbent user and say, hey, I want to do this new thing. You might be able to work it out. 3 years might be a long time for some people's budget, but it's still, you might be able to work it out in these situations. But one way you can help on that is if the incumbent doesn't think they could rely on an FCC accepting any argument of interference being harmful interference. Right. Mm-hmm. If they didn't have a backstop where they thought, well, I can make any argument and it's going to tie them up at the FCC for 5 years, or the FCC is going to accept it, then that negotiation is going to go a lot better. But if they think the FCC is going to take forever or they're going to accept any argument, then that power dynamic is really bad, like you described.
Well, you know, not to argue this too much, it took a while, but I mean, look at how long white space has taken.
Yep.
And so, you know, and I'm not saying that that's an example of if they'd all gotten together before the rules came out and worked it out, it would have taken any less time. Yeah. But I think it speaks to the different players, if you will, in the discussion and their alacrity to share. And the AMT guys, the aeronautical mobile telemetry guys, understood that they're not using the spectrum all over the country, whereas there was a value in allowing, you know, healthcare use. And it's not critically ill patients, but the argument that was made that sort of moved this argument along was that if a patient presents at the hospital and has some form of acuity, they've got some illness, and they can be monitored the minute they walk into the hospital. If they have a crash, they have a 93% chance of surviving some sort of a crash, meaning they could have a heart attack, some sort of a thing that would cause them to otherwise, you know, have high rate of mortality is the euphemism they use. They can be monitored. They have a 93% chance of survival. And so that argument sort of got itself into the discussions, and both sides really cooperated. It took a while, and there were a lot of outside experts that got into it, but I think it's an example that if the stakes are that high, they can find a way to work it out.
Well, I just want to, just before we...
One last comment, and then we'll go to the back.
I'll do it very quick.
No, take your time.
Yeah, no, I was going to do it very quick, which is just, it sort of builds on my point of making sure that it's a win-win. I mean, because if you come in and you launch something into the FCC, the reaction by anybody when you come into their neighborhood is really, why are you here? Move away. But if you've already worked it out ahead of time and made it obvious what the win-win is, that there's some advantage for that discussion, other than I'm just going to compete with you, which is probably not a good way to start your negotiation. I'm just throwing that out there. So I think you just have to understand the win-win part of this.
Yeah.
Next question, please.
Hi, Michael Down with Microsoft. I think the first a comment about the body area networks. I think one of the other things that happened in parallel was there was a part of the FAA authorization bill that addressed it, and it was a forcing function. As with a lot of things that go on in DC, it's a complex interplay between the Hill and the Commission, and so there's a lot of other stuff going on. There was another band where they had tried to address this issue about competing interests, and it was the 3650 to 3700 band where there was a light licensing regime. And this was a band where in other bands there's first in rights. So if you're in first and someone else comes into your territory, the FCC kind of gives a benefit of the doubt to the person who's already there. In that band, it was people would set up WISPs, and they were setting up all over, and then there were new WISP entrants that were kind of interfering with the existing ones.
Could you just define WISPs for us?
A wireless internet service provider, sorry.
Thank you.
And there was, I believe, a court case where one of the WISPs wanted the FCC to enforce the rules and work out the interference, and the FCC said, no, these rules are where you guys have to figure it out. They took it to court, and the court said, no, FCC, that's what it says. You guys have to figure it out, and they did. So how would you look at the light licensing regime as something where, again, it's a very light touch and where the participants in the band have to resolve their differences?
So any thoughts about light licensing as a precedent?
I think it is one of the things that's in the middle, right, between pure unlicensed and the kind of, exclusive use. I think that process for coordination was overly cumbersome, and that band has not seen a whole lot of use today because of that. And again, that goes back to more code, less poobahs, right, in that process. And I think that band is being, merged in with 3550 to 3650 and 3.5 proceeding. So I think we'll have a good opportunity to drive more players into that ecosystem because of the benefits.
Yeah, I'd like to comment on that, because if you go back and look at the record, the reason the Commission did what they did was because the overwhelming majority of WISPs didn't want to have the first-in-time rights because they didn't want to have that's so the Commission gave them what they wanted. But there will be a WISP on the next panel, so I'd be curious to get his take on it. We're in the middle of a lot of that, and we saw situations where there were some bad actors in the band too. And that goes back to what I said a moment ago earlier, which is you still need to have a regulatory body to give you some enforcement relief.
Agreed.
But when you're lightly licensed and you don't have first-in-time rights, you kind of wonder, well, so what's the standard? The Commission made it clear, though, that you've got to work it out among yourself. And I think the problem was that that's a community that is used to doing that in certain areas, but in this area they probably weren't. And that's sort of evolved now to a point where they've got it worked out, at least to the point where they don't seem to be the fair number of just people plopping down on top of others and thinking they can get away with it. But it does require, and the Wireless Internet Service Providers Association, WISPA, has actually helped a lot with that as well. I thought when you started talking about that, you were going to talk about the earth stations in there, which that's another issue, which I'm not going to mention, but.
So actually, before we've got two more questions, but I just wanted, Matt, do you want to comment on this or leave it for later? Since we have, okay. So we have two questions, one in the front and then Laura in the back.
Hi, Patrick Rein with Google. Although David and Phil kindly let me claim a CU affiliation still. I'm wondering to what extent this is even solvable here in the United States at the FCC. I appreciate the focus on the FCC, but how bold is the FCC going to be in order to deviate from the international rules of the International Telecommunication Union and the system that's in place, that's been in place for so many decades? It's so ingrained globally. Can one country out of 193 in the UN really move the ball here?
Yes.
Yeah, I was going to say.
Yeah, absolutely.
All right, one at a time. We'll start that
first. They do it all the time.
Yeah,
And in fact,
exactly.
we often advocate saying the FCC should follow the international, and they say, no, we're the U.S. We'll do what we're going to do.
Right.
So if anything, it's the opposite. The U.S. tends to push the envelope very hard. Now, I will tell you, business folks looking at that don't think it's that hard at times, and it takes too long. But if you compare it, again, to other countries and how other countries react to this, and obviously Europe is a much different situation when you have that many countries right on top of each other to deal with, whereas we just have Canada and Mexico to deal with. We can make policies and we have a lot less problems because Canada follows us and Mexico follows Canada. So it's not a hard rubric to sort of figure out. So I'm just going to say that. I just don't find the ITU process being stifling to the U.S. I find it the opposite way completely.
Yeah, look at all those footnotes in the table of allocations.
Oh, yeah.
So.
The only...
Sorry, Nancy, just for the benefit of those who don't understand ITU, what do you mean by all those footnotes?
The table of allocations indicates both the international allocations for spectrum, and if you look in the FCC's rules, also how it's being used domestically. Usually where there's a footnote, it's where there is a departure from what happened internationally. There are a lot of footnotes in it.
So I want to put two asterisks on that. Where, I was going to say
on the no or
on the no. And so I think that there are ways that the ITU system can slow us down. And that's one, when the ITU or other countries following the ITU that maybe don't have as deep a bench at their commission as we do, follow more retrograde policies, that makes the scale efficiencies much harder for equipment. And so that can mess up what we're doing by making the innovative things that we do more expensive to do on a one country basis or on a small number of countries basis. The other thing is that you often see people go play offense at the ITU in order to import kind of problems back domestically. And so,
could you give an example?
I think you see fighting in the ITU even now on government bans, where you'll have government users at the ITU making arguments that are quite inconsistent with the U.S. government users at the ITU making arguments that are different than the arguments that are being maybe adopted by the FCC. And so that's another way where the ITU can slow us down in places. The FCC absolutely is and been great about being able to cut its own path through the woods. But the ITU can cause problems for us.
Well, I guess it's
I'll add a third one to that, too.
Yep.
Because if we're going to talk about problems, it's always easy to talk about problems when we have DC involved. But
yeah.
In the satellite realm, too. I mean, I won't underestimate, if you're trying to deal with satellites, ITU becomes a big problem. Yeah. And if folks are now looking at these low-cost satellites, good luck getting every landing right across the world through the ITU process, because we do a lot of work for Iridium. It's a lot of fun. It's a lot of fun dealing with all those different requirements. I'll add that asterisk.
But it's interesting. We were talking about nested governance, right? So this is another layer. This is the big
the
doll,
big poobah,
right?
It's the big poobah.
Yeah. And so I think what I'm hearing you say, would anybody contradict this, is nested governance, yes, but keep pushing it down as far as possible. Any reason not to do that?
Well,
Not down to the states.
Top level government may not be as bad as the ITU, but the ITU is a special failure mode, right? That's especially bad, right? So I think it's ITU and innovation are sometimes referred to as antonyms, right?
Okay.
Yeah, and I'm not sure pushing it down. It depends what you mean by pushing it down. If it's pushing it down to smaller and smaller inconsistent government decision makers, that's not good, right? You do want to have something that allows you to have a national rule and that can't be overruled by some subpart of that government. And so you don't want to kind of cut a deal at the national level and then have an individual part of a government agency say they don't agree with that, for example. But it is good once you have a rule to be able to negotiate and with sub-agencies or small problems to not let individual geographies or corner cases drive the ability to make more global solutions.
Right, okay. and I think we have to keep in mind what aspect of command and control we're talking about, because clearly there are benefits to having commonalities within the region or globally as to how spectrum is going to be used. I mean, as Tom said, Europe, it is a daily consideration for the U.S., where we only have to worry about Canada and Mexico on two of our borders. It's less of a concern for us. But it is a big concern about manufacturers because of economies of scale. But we certainly don't want the ITU deciding radio standards or power limits or eligibility rules or anything like that. So I think we just want to be clear. There is a role for the ITU, and it's probably, you know, in some ways it's probably good that they only have the radio conferences every 3 years. But you know, in terms of providing that basic framework so that the system can work globally, it is important.
Okay, last point.
I think in the old days, the global standards drove the ecosystem. It's now the opposite. That is to say, ecosystems now drive global allocations. And I think that makes the entire role of the ITU, you have to look at the role of the ITU in that light very, very differently.
Okay.
I don't think they look at it in that light, but that's part of the source of the challenge.
So, Pierre, I'm not going to let you have that be the last word, because a suggestion for a future panel is we focus a lot on decentralized power and about lack of command and control in spectrum. And like we said, we have to think about how far we've come in spectrum, but also and how far the U.S. has come versus some others. But let's not also forget that a lot of these same lessons can be applied to other parts of what the FCC does. And so, and in spectrum, they often do it better than in a lot of the other places.
Could you give an example?
For example, I think there are things that are incredibly important, like accessibility regulations, right? We all believe that we have to have accessibility regulations that work. But we don't really consider the lessons of spectrum when we think about something like that, where we say, hey, let's define an end goal that we all want to get to, and let's set up rules that allow innovation to get to that end goal, rather than having very bright line command and control rules that lock in yesterday's technology. So, you know, the hearing aid compatibility rules, incredibly important, but they are about as command and control as you can get. And there's probably ideas outside of the spectrum context, and spectrum leads at the FCC in terms of being innovative, even though we sometimes complain about it. So we need to think about it in those places.
Very good. So we have one last question, and then I'm going to, we're almost out of time, but this is so much fun. The last question for each of the panelists, I'm going to ask you just to suggest one thing that we can do, should do as a country to improve decentralization. If there's one thing, or if you think we're fine, you can pass. So last question, Laura. And please identify yourself.
Hi, I'm Laura Lippman. I'm at the Zayo group here in Boulder, but I worked with Pierre all year last year, so you can probably tell him my question. I guess what keeps coming up is just to work together and to, you know, work problems out between each other. And I'm thinking, well, then what does the FCC do? The one thing they still are doing are the regulations that will be negotiated in the negotiations that will be discussed. So when I think of what should be in those regulations, I am very curious about balancing rules versus standards. So, and I think it could go, at first it seemed like an easy answer, but do you want more rules or more standards in these regulations when what you're saying to do is for parties to negotiations to be working things out on their own? So I think you can argue, you know, for the, you know, more rules or more standards, and I'm just wondering what your opinion is if the answer's for parties to negotiate between themselves.
I think that's one, Paul, I'd start with you, and I'd almost add, what heuristics would you use or recommend? Because presumably it's a case-by-case decision. So when do you go for the one and when do you go for the other?
Yeah. I mean, I think that the goal is not to have standards that that cloud what people's responsibilities are. I think if that's what standards mean, then I don't like them as much. What I think I'm looking for are rules that provide predictability but flexibility, right?
And so actually one of the, I'm sorry, we should, since we have both lawyers and engineers in the room, so standards don't mean standards. So rules are bright line rules and standards are principles, general principles, right?
Yeah, so I think there is a role for standards, but I guess what I was talking about are actual rules.
Okay.
So you know what they are, but they are not at that extreme of command and control that say there's going to be one rule for all situations no matter what. Now, the way you can introduce flexibility to those is to say, okay, here's what we're going to do. We're going to, for example, on power, right? One way you could build in flexibility without getting rid of predictability is say, okay, instead of having the blunt tool of a maximum power at the transmitter,
Yep.
we're going to look at something more like received power at the interferer, at the interferee.
Yep.
And then you can do whatever you want at your transmitter.
Yep.
You have lots of flexibility, but the interferee always knows that they're going to be below a certain level, right? So that's, I guess, what I'm talking about.
Let me just add on to that. So what I think I look at it is, let's have a level set framework. And we create that level set framework, and parties can figure out how they go up and down to that level set, whatever it is, whether it's power, whether it's out-of-band emissions, whatever it is, you leave them to innovate to figure out how they do that. So that's number one. But number two, and I think is the problem we have, frankly, and it doesn't benefit me to say this out loud, is that what we really need is a way to change those things quickly.
Yep.
Right.
So we've set a level set, everything has changed.
Yep.
How do we change it quickly? How do we tell the broadcasters, by the way, digital ATSC is really interesting 25 years ago, but it's not real interesting now.
Right.
So can we level set really quickly? No, we cannot, because there's political, there's investment, there's, all those sort of things. So we need to find a way to sort of add some viscosity, for your term, to that process. You've set the level, but it should be able to be changed up or down quickly.
Yeah. That's very good. So you actually get 4 panelists to think about the answer to your own question. So I'm going to wrap us up, start with Milo and go down one idea of something that we can do to improve matters and get more decentralization.
I think it goes back to what really are we trying to accomplish? Mm-hmm. Are we trying to get spectrum policy changes implemented much more quickly, set actually a benchmark and then measure against it? What are we trying to look for idle spectrum and come up with quick ways to get that authorized for broader sets of uses, right? And I think sharing is easier to navigate in that context than full relocation and clearing. So clearing may be cool, but it just sure takes a long time.
So do you have everything you need to do that?
I think the commission processes don't take cost of time, the time value of decision making into account.
So that's the problem. What's the solution?
You could do things like shock clocks and other things that could take that into account. But there also needs to be a certain level of comfort with ambiguity. Engineers tend to deal with that. Lawyers tend not to like that. And we just have, because things change over time, and we just need to be a little bit more flexible.
Thank you. Paul?
I guess I would say the thing that would help would be for the FCC to, and clearly state that the big goal is to maximize utility, right? I think that's one big thing, to say, look, here's the game. The game is maximize utility.
And that would supersede the public interest?
That is, that goes to the public. Where's Michael Powell? That goes to the public interest, right? A big part of that is maximizing. I'm a Chicago guy. It's maximizing utility, especially in spectrum. I think that's the best way they can do it. And then just do, right? Keep doing things. And so, you move ahead with white spaces. That builds a foundation to be able to do 3.5. And then you can do 3.5 and you can keep going from there. You have to just do.
Good. So we actually have, you've heard it here first, the slogan for the next FCC commissioner. It's not going to be competition. Do. Nancy?
I'm being a little facetious in saying a large room where the doors lock. Going back to transparency and trust, I was at NTIA when we freed up the AWS-1 spectrum. The reason that occurred, and definitely Congress helped. It said you have to fund spectrum, so there was some motivation on behalf of the federal government. But we essentially locked the commercial operators, not really, but we put the commercial operators in a room with the government engineers. We had the commercial users sign an NDA. We had people get to know each other to develop trust. We had a very long and free exchange about facts. It wasn't filtered through lawyers in comments in an FCC proceeding. It was the engineers being able to challenge the assertions, learn about each other's technology, and they figured it out. And that's essentially what happened with AWS-3. And I think that works for band clearing. It's awfully tough. I think it works for sharing because you need to understand each other's technology and try to figure out how they can cohabitate or how one can be more efficient or how one can move to other spectrum. But there needs to be a full and fair sharing of facts and a development of trust between the folks who are talking.
Very good.
And that's why I say a big room with locks on the door.
Good, thank you.
So I take Paul's point, do, and add less. Because I really think that, you know, we rely too much on the commission. And I think the commission kind of has played into that role for years and years. And I think, you know, white space is an example of what's happened. And, you know, there's reasons for why it happened. But AWS-3 isn't a good example. There was a guideline. We got together, the room that Nancy's talking about, under CSMAC, and it took a while. But the engineers worked it out, and there were no policymakers in the room, or if they did, they were disguised as engineers, which is, you know, a cardinal sin. And so I think that if, you know, as we're going toward areas of less poobah and more code, you know, the commission needs to have a lighter touch on the regulation. I think we as spectrum users need to know that we have some sort of enforcement relief, that they're going to be there as the traffic cop. But they set up you know, it's like they throw out thought balloons. Okay, here is some spectrum. What would you want to do with it? And get all the people in the room that have a stake in that and work it out and come back. Now I know that's utopia, and I think in a real world, that AWS, I think, as Nancy said, is a good example of there was a framework. We went off, we figured out how to share, and then after that, there was a rulemaking. May have overlapped a little bit. So do, less.
Very good.
Well,
Tom, you get the last word.
Yeah, my last point is just that, you know, the problem we have is we always try to guess where we're going. And today we'll make a decision, and we're going to be tied to that decision for a long period of time. So to give a good example, when we took that spectrum from the TV users to create the cellular band, everybody said that's junk spectrum. What are you doing with that? When they did 2.4 gigahertz, the ISM band, they said that's junk spectrum. What are you going to do with that? So we don't know what's going to happen. Now we're doing with millimeter waves. We're now suddenly millimeter waves are hot spectrum. So
that was never junk, though.
It was never junk. It was never junk. However, I'm just saying we don't know where things are going. We think we know. And our problem is we make decisions based on today, but we don't have a real quick ability to change those decisions if it doesn't prove out to be the truth.
Yep. Wonderful point. Thank you so much. We didn't run over by too much, but we had so much fun. I hope you had as much fun as we did. Thank you very much.